My husband joked at a family reunion that he always dreamed of being with a blonde, but I'm a brunette. When I told him it hurt me, he said I was being too sensitive and couldn't take a joke. Hello everyone, I'm a 32-year-old woman who's always been deeply in love with my husband. We've been together for over a decade now, and for the most part, I thought I understood him completely, his humor, his quirks, and the way he sees the world. But this one comment, at a family reunion no less, made me question everything. We had gathered at his cousin's house for the annual reunion, a large, casual event filled with laughter, stories, and the usual loud banter. The scent of grilled food and the sound of children playing in the yard created the perfect atmosphere. At least, that's what I thought. It was supposed to be a day of lighthearted fun, a chance for family to reconnect and unwind. Little did I know, my world would soon be rocked by something I never expected to come from the person I trusted most. My husband, Derek, is the kind of guy who's always the center of attention at gatherings like these. He's charming, quick-witted, and has a knack for making people laugh. I've always admired his ability to make everyone feel included, but sometimes his jokes have a sharp edge, and this time, that edge cut deeper than I could have imagined. We were all standing around the backyard, sharing stories and catching up, when Derek made his fateful joke. It was one of those moments where the conversation was flowing, and people were talking about relationships and how everyone ended up with their partners. And out of nowhere, Derek dropped it, casually, almost carelessly. "You know," he said with a grin, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "I always dreamed of being with a blonde, but look at me now." He gestured toward me with a laugh as though it was nothing more than a harmless quip. The group chuckled, some even louder than others. But me? I froze. For a split second, I wasn't sure if I had misheard him or if he was actually saying what I thought he was. Was he joking? Of course, he was. But the words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to laugh it off, to join in the lighthearted moment. But I couldn't. I just stood there, trying to smile while my stomach twisted in knots. I felt exposed, humiliated even. Sure, it was a joke to everyone else, but to me, it felt like he was saying that I wasn't enough, that I wasn't his ideal. And worst of all, he said it in front of all our family. In front of everyone who knew us, who knew our relationship. It wasn't just a private moment between us, it was something shared with an entire room, and I felt small. I didn't know what to do in that moment. My heart raced, and I suddenly felt like I was on display. There were other people around, and they laughed, but their laughter felt like it was drowning out the shock and pain that flooded my chest. I tried to force a smile, but the sting was there, deep inside. Did anyone notice? Did anyone see how it affected me? It didn't matter. I felt like a fool. All I could think about was that my husband, my partner, the person who promised to love me, had just made me feel invisible. It was a simple joke, wasn't it? Maybe to him. But to me, it was something else entirely. I wanted to call him out on it right there, to ask him what the hell he was thinking, but I didn't. Instead, I swallowed my hurt and pushed it down, hoping the feeling would go away. But it didn't. It lingered, gnawing at me as the conversation shifted and the laughter carried on. I stood there, a forced smile on my face, pretending like everything was fine, all the while my heart aching. That night, when we got home, I couldn't shake the comment. It replayed in my mind over and over again. Was it really that funny? Was I being too sensitive? I'd never questioned my relationship before, but in that moment, I felt something shift. I didn't know how to approach him, or even if I should. Maybe I was overreacting. But I couldn't ignore how deeply it hurt. And so, I decided to bring it up, to tell him how I felt. Little did I know, this would be the beginning of something that would make me question not just that moment, but the very foundation of our relationship. After the reunion, I spent the entire evening replaying Derek's comment in my head, trying to understand why it had affected me so much. Was it truly just a joke? Was I overreacting? He had made plenty of jokes like that in the past, but none had made me feel so exposed, so diminished. Maybe I was just too sensitive. But deep down, I knew something was off. This wasn't about the joke itself, it was about how I felt after hearing it. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't enough for him. That maybe, in some part of his mind, he regretted choosing me over the blondes he dreamt of. I had spent years building a life with him, investing in our relationship, and yet, one comment, one throwaway remark, made me feel like I had failed somehow. Was I really just a placeholder? Someone who didn't fit the mold of his ideal partner? It was late when we got home, and Derek was in the kitchen, fiddling with something, probably looking for a snack. The house felt oddly quiet, too quiet. My heart pounded as I stood at the doorway, trying to find the right words to bring up what had happened. I could hear him humming to himself, completely oblivious to what was going on inside my mind. Finally, I took a deep breath and walked in. "Derek, we need to talk." He didn't even look up at first. "Yeah?" he said casually, still looking through the cupboard. "What's up?" I stood there, unsure of how to even begin. It wasn't that I didn't want to confront him, it was that I wasn't sure how to express what I was feeling. The hurt, the anger, the confusion, it all mixed into a whirlwind in my chest, and I couldn't get the words to come out. Finally, I just said it. "That joke you made today, about how you always dreamed of being with a blonde. It really hurt me, Derek." He paused for a moment, finally turning around. There was a slight frown on his face, but more than anything, he just looked confused, like he didn't understand what the big deal was. "Oh, come on," he said, rolling his eyes slightly. "It was just a joke." The way he said it, so nonchalant, made my stomach turn. "I know it was a joke, but it wasn't funny. You made me feel like I wasn't enough for you," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "You made me feel small in front of everyone. You embarrassed me." Derek's expression shifted from confusion to annoyance. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "Are you serious right now?" he said, his voice cold. "You're really going to make a big deal out of this?" "I was just messing around. It's not like I meant anything by it." I felt my anger rise, but I held it in, trying to keep my voice steady. "That's not the point, Derek. It's not about the joke, it's about how you made me feel. And you didn't even apologize. You just laughed like it was no big deal. You're my husband. You should care about how I feel." He stared at me for a long moment, like he was processing what I said. But then, just as quickly, he shrugged, letting out an exasperated sigh. "Look, you're being way too sensitive. You can't take a joke. This is exactly why I hate when people get all bent out of shape over something so small. It's just a harmless comment." His words cut through me like a knife. "Harmless?" I repeated, barely able to believe what I was hearing. "That's how you see it? Like I'm just being dramatic?" "You're overreacting," he said flatly. "Honestly, I didn't think you'd be the type of person to get all upset over something like this. It wasn't a big deal." The dismissal stung more than I ever could have imagined. I had expected some form of empathy, some acknowledgement that he had hurt me. But instead, he dismissed my feelings entirely. He was making it clear that my hurt didn't matter, that it was all in my head, that I was the one who was wrong for being upset. I felt small, my chest tightening as I tried to hold back tears. "It wasn't just a joke, Derek. It was a joke at my expense. And you didn't even think twice about how it might make me feel." He sighed heavily and ran a hand through his hair. "I didn't mean anything by it. You know I love you. This is ridiculous." But his words felt hollow. "You love me?" I said, trying to control my emotions. "Then why didn't you care that you hurt me? Why didn't you care enough to apologize?" He raised an eyebrow and shook his head. "Because you're making something out of nothing. It's not like I said something awful. You're being too dramatic, and it's really starting to get on my nerves." I felt like I was losing control, like the ground beneath me was slipping away. My husband, the man I loved, the man I had trusted, was not only dismissing my feelings, but making me feel like the problem. I wasn't the one who had done something wrong, but somehow, in his eyes, I was the one who needed to apologize. The more I tried to explain how I felt, the more it seemed like he wasn't hearing me. My words bounced off him like they meant nothing. He was stubborn, convinced that I was just being too sensitive, too emotional. It made me question whether he ever really saw me the way I saw him. If he couldn't even acknowledge how I was feeling, how could I trust that he understood me? After a long, Tense silence, I turned away from him, feeling completely defeated. I'm not going to keep fighting about this, I said quietly. But it hurt, Derek. It really hurt. And I need you to understand that. I understand, he said with a sigh, though his tone was dismissive, his eyes already distant. I'm sorry you feel that way. But it's not a big deal. Can we just drop it now? I felt the weight of his words hang in the air. And just like that, the conversation was over. He had dismissed me, my feelings, everything. It felt like the last bit of trust one had in him had started to slip away. The days after that conversation felt like an emotional fog had descended over me. I kept thinking about what Derek had said, or rather, what he hadn't said. He hadn't acknowledged my hurt, not in any meaningful way. All I got was a quick, dismissive apology that wasn't an apology at all. It was more like he was brushing me off, trying to move past the issue without any genuine reflection. The more I thought about it, the more I started to doubt everything. Had I really been too sensitive? Was I overreacting? Or was this just the way he always dealt with conflict, by shutting it down, making me feel like I was the problem? I couldn't stop replaying that moment at the reunion in my head. He didn't just make a harmless joke, he made me feel invisible, unworthy, like I didn't belong in the life we had built together. And when I tried to express how much it hurt, he just made me feel like I was crazy for caring. It was hard to ignore that the pattern seemed to repeat itself. It wasn't just this one incident. I began to notice the way Derek dismissed my feelings in other situations too. When I needed reassurance, he would brush me off with a joke or say something to minimize my concerns. When I felt anxious about something, he'd tell me to calm down or stop overthinking. It was subtle, these little jabs and dismissals, but they added up over time. And with each passing day, I started to wonder if I was just a fool for thinking I could make him see things from my perspective. Was this the man I had built my life with? The man who promised to stand by me, to care for me, to listen to me? Or was he someone I barely knew? Someone who didn't take my feelings seriously, who found it easier to invalidate me than to take responsibility for his actions. The turning point came one evening when I was sitting alone in the living room, scrolling through old pictures on my phone. I came across a photo from our wedding day, the day when we both promised we'd always have each other's backs, no matter what. In that moment, the weight of everything hit me hard. How had we gone from that moment, full of love and promises, to this, where I felt more like an afterthought than the woman he had chosen to marry? I needed to make a decision. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly questioning my worth in our relationship. I needed to stand up for myself and stop letting him dictate how I felt. So, I decided to talk to him again. But this time, I wouldn't just let him dismiss me. This time, I was ready to stand my ground. The conversation wasn't easy. I told Derek that I couldn't continue in a relationship where my feelings were continually invalidated, where I was made to feel like my hurt didn't matter. I told him how I had tried, time and time again, to be open and honest about my emotions, but that he kept shutting me down. I told him that I needed more than jokes and dismissive comments. I needed respect. And I needed him to take my feelings seriously. At first, he was defensive. He insisted that he didn't mean any harm, that it was just his way of joking around. But I stood firm. I told him that his words had hurt me, and that his refusal to acknowledge my pain made it impossible for me to continue pretending that everything was okay. I wasn't asking for a grand apology, I was asking for understanding, for validation. It was then that he paused. The defensiveness faded from his face, replaced by something else. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was realization. But for the first time in a long while, he looked at me with a sincerity that I hadn't seen before. I didn't realize it hurt you that much, he said quietly. I guess I've been so used to joking around that I didn't stop to think about how it made you feel. I'm sorry, I really am. It wasn't a perfect apology, and it wasn't going to fix everything overnight. But it was a start. He finally heard me. For the first time in a long time, I felt like my feelings mattered to him. The tension that had been hanging between us began to lift, and though there was still work to do, I knew this was the first step toward something better. I realized then that relationships aren't just built on love, They're built on respect, on mutual understanding, and on the willingness to listen. I had been afraid of confronting Derek, afraid that it would make things worse or push him away. But in the end, it was that confrontation that allowed us to grow, both as individuals and as a couple. It wasn't easy, and it didn't fix everything in one conversation. But it gave me the clarity I needed. I was no longer willing to settle for being dismissed or invalidated. I deserved more than that. And if Derek truly wanted to make this work, he needed to prove that he could give me the respect and understanding I had been craving all along.